Hey, come over here. I've got something to show you. Phthalo green. Hands down my favorite color. Highly transparent and full of depth. Tints to an intense cool green, the color of specked linnets under fruit tree boughs, ghostly ectoplasm, and lime fruit curd in cold cups. Phthalo green is also the color of oblivion, of summer naps in my hammock when my body is angry for more sleep and chirping birds are the only music. No one painted oblivion better than Irish-born British painter Francis Bacon. In the 1960s, my teacher, Michael Tyzak, drank in Soho clubs with Bacon, who bought champagne for everyone and made bizarre proclamations like, "I can't draw." According to writer and painter Michael Wishart, Bacon colored his hair, appropriately for the particular social occasion, by mixing various tones of brown kiwi shoe polish on the back of his hand. The color was applied with a shoe brush. He polished his teeth with vim. In the late 1950s, phthalo green began to appear on Bacon's palette. Because of its tiny pigment particles, phthalo seeps into every crevice of canvas and skin, making it ideal for staining surfaces in rich, transparent dark. If you ever meet me, look at my nail beds and you'll see phthalo green. You can also see it whenever I tell somebody that they're number one. When Bacon's lover, George Dyer, overdosed on alcohol and sleeping tablets in a Left Bank hotel room, Bacon created a series of portraits with backgrounds stained phthalo green to convey fathomless oblivion. However, Study for Head of George Dyer, 1967, isn't about yearning for his friend, but prolonging his own suffering. Phthalo green is the perfect choice because it doesn't sit on the canvas, it is the canvas, allowing Bacon a field onto which to expose animal bone and fascia with X-ray clarity. Bacon wrote, "I would like my pictures to look as if a human being had passed between them, like a snail, leaving a trail of the human presence and memory trace of past events, as the snail leaves its slime." Applying coats of paint, one over another, is an accumulation of experiences and thereby alludes to history, because each successive layer represents a past moment in time. However, a stain permeates every thread of the weave. With no past, no future, phthalo green is plotless, like life itself. Back in the hammock, my body is still angry for sleep. So I go indoors, undress, and climb into bed. I always sleep better when the clock is wound. Before we go forward, let's go back. All the way back to May 2001, almost 20 years ago, and my first museum retrospective. This was a 10-year survey exhibition at the Butler Institute of American Art, one of the finest museums in America. I say it all the time, but none of this would have been possible without my role models. From the powerful women in my life, like Katie, my mother-in-law, my aunt, sisters-in-law, and my dealers. To my father, father-in-law, brothers, and my biggest mentors and patrons. I know how lucky I am. About 50 of my collectors and friends flew from all around the country to Youngstown, Ohio, for the reception and sit-down dinner in the gallery. We got a special group rate on a hotel, airfares. We rented vans and planned an afternoon of activities and meals for our guests. I had just joined Forum Gallery in New York City and was touched that the owners, Bob and Cheryl, took time out of their busy schedules to be there in person to support me. Being an artist is familial. We don't work alone. We are a self-selected tribe, who speak in tongue and wear the face paint of mandrels. I can spot a fellow painter from across the room. You can tell by the way they eat pancakes. A painter puts the syrup on in circles, a non-painter in crisscross. The Butler Institute of American Art is a wonderful museum to visit, and I encourage you to do so when our mobility returns. Our museums will need us more than ever. I moved to New York City in 1987, the day after graduating from my beloved College of Charleston. To support myself, I played drums and worked in the storerooms of a shoe store and 2 art galleries as an art handler. These were the early 1990s, when I experimented with trying to look ironic. I wore a goatee, tight jeans, Doc Martens, and patchouli. But I looked more like the Hamburglar than a hipster. I'm too goofy and upbeat to pull off irony. It's not that I'm too old, but it's that I want to get old. Life is too short to be snarky. In the gallery storerooms, I learned how to pack paintings and sculptures, and those skills came in handy when I was first starting shipping my own work. I have dealers who do all of that for me now, but here are a few tips. If you wrap a painting in plastic, try to invest in a roll of glassine. Put a layer of this glassine between the surface of the painting and the plastic. It resists sticking and is pH neutral. If you use bubble wrap, make sure it's bubble side out. I saw a painting covered in a pattern of circles like meteors because the gas in the bubbles had escaped and pressed onto the painting. To keep plastic away from the painted surface, you can fashion collars out of cardboard or bubble wrap. Take a rectangular piece of cardboard and then cut 2 slits in it about the width of the depth of your stretcher. Then cut along the middle and take that piece and place it on the corner of the painting so that the corner sticks through. Do this on all 4 corners and then take plastic tape and connect all 4 of the collars, 1 on each corner. This creates a layer that keeps the plastic away from the surface of your painting, like a snare drum. You can also do this with bubble wrap by folding a wad of bubble wrap and placing that around each corner, taped all the way around in the same way to keep any glassine or plastic away from your picture surface. For my works on paper, which are painted on 300-pound watercolor block, in order to get them to the framer, they have to be soft packed in my studio. What I do is get 2 very thick sheets of foam core, the top and the bottom, and then I cut long strips of 1-inch corrugated cardboard. I glue that into a rectangle a little bit larger than the work on paper. I let it dry, and then I can slip the works on paper right into these little slots. Then another goes on top, a piece of foam core, and then another drawing on top of that. So it's stacked, kind of like a Twix. Be prepared for dings and scrapes to happen. It's unavoidable. When I was 18, I was dropping some of my paintings off at the City Gallery in Charleston, South Carolina for a group show. And I was slinging them out of my Honda Accord and stacking them up against the wall. And the curator said, "You treat your paintings like old shoes." And from that day on, I have thought of my paintings as old shoes. Don't be precious. Don't take yourself too seriously. Scratch the surface of any pretentious asshole and you'll find the Hamburglar.
One of the things I love about living here in New York City are the extreme viewpoints, both philosophically and literally. So much of life is looking side to side or straight ahead, but here you can't get around unless you look up and also go down. A good part of my day is spent in the subways, and that has certainly had an effect on the way that I think about pictorial space. So I'll talk about what I mean by that. I can't feel my private parts right now. It's really cold. So let's go downtown.
My Metro card is a passport to the universe in its totality. With each descending step, I whisper to myself, Tooker, Tooker, Tooker. You can't know the subway without knowing about the American painter George Tooker. This painting from 1950 called Subway is a haunting commentary on social injustice and alienation. Identical figures occupy the same space, yet are isolated and unable to communicate. To achieve this, Tooker uses long sightlines, exaggerated perspectives, and multiple vanishing points to achieve attention and confusion as if always in a state of becoming and never being. Tooker wrote that he chose the subway because it represented a denial of the senses. I love that. For me, I find great solace in the subway. The entire spatial system I've developed in my paintings is, in large part, a gift from the downtown number 1 train. From extreme scale shifts of close and far, shiny enamel tiles, the rhythmic interplay of repeating columns, echoed by the clickety-clack of trains, and my use of lintels, which are the horizontal beams over doors that carry heavy loads between columns. In the subway, these are usually decorated with ceramic filigree or ornate florets, and they are lovely. My paintings often have thicker passages which span the top third of the painting and give the impression of containment in an enclosed space. Here's an example of a painting I'm working on which has this lintel effect. And here's one without. You can see that each projects a different feeling to the viewer. The strong vertical signifiers, these are not trees, are the columns that support the weight and provide the elemental clickety-clack. I'm pretty sure I'm the only painter who uses clickety-clack as a technical term. You might not have a subway where you live, but don't let the sun set every day until you've turned your attentive eye to what's over your head and under your sneakers. Anything less is a denial of the senses. It's helpful to consider the difference between picturing and a picture. Picturing is active. It includes the viewer. Both the maker and the taker craft and discover something simultaneously. When Goya presents a group of people and shows us the back of the head of one of the spectators, that's his way of including us in the perceptual envelope of the painting. By contrast, a picture is passive. It is the fragment of a continuous view that would go on even if the viewer was hit by a bus. All roads would still lead to the vanishing point. Of Dutch art, the painter Joshua Reynolds wrote, "You can't tell the story of a Dutch painting. You can only look at it. What you see is what matters." In a Vermeer painting, knowledge is abandoned in favor of experience. Names are irrelevant. A nose doesn't declare itself a nose, but a soft wedge of glowing color that signifies noseness. When you give up matching and start making, you find a kind of poetic detachment that's more fun than sex with a feather duster. When we project our vitality onto something separate from ourselves, we confront otherness. All great art puts us in this state of poetic externalization because we bear witness to the artist, overhearing him or herself in the moment of creation, as if the work is being made as we look at it. Leonardo da Vinci wrote, "The painter's mind should be like a mirror which transforms itself into the color of the thing that it has as its object." It's not enough to just observe an object. You must represent it in your mind. Painting depends on your mental point of view, not your moral point of view. That's the problem I have with so much contemporary painting. When you yell messages at your viewer and try to sound smarter than everyone else in the room, you end up with ungenerous painting. Never underestimate your viewer. Picasso shows us only one side of a face, but our mind fills in the other side. Everything you see is equally true if you unsee it. In other words, an eye not told what to see sees more. Paint for the attentive eye. As I paint, I imagine sticking hundreds of eyes into the wet pigment, so that the painting has already been seen from every possible angle and is warmed up before the viewer ever even arrives. I learned this a long time ago from this drawing by Jacques Degaine called Old Woman and Vine, in which he drew an actual human eye peering from inside the composition. I suspect that this is to mark a sightline for the viewer, but for me, it was a method that I still use today. I put hidden eyes into my paintings like diamonds. Art historian and critic John Berger wrote that every image used by a spectator is a going further than he could have achieved alone. The only difference between a sword swallower and me is that the sword swallower was willing to take it further. An artist is simply someone willing to work harder than anyone else in the room on stuff that nobody else cares about. As a student of art history, I find myself going farther back in time to look for links and clues to help me better understand different ways of seeing, to develop what the 17th century Dutch painters called the attentive eye. We don't paint in a vacuum. Everything under the sun has already been done, just not by you. That's all the permission you need. If you're just starting out, I'd recommend not focusing on individual artists, but rather looking at broader movements and schools. 3 of the broad movements I'm studying at the moment are the Nazarene painters, the Camden Town School, and the Group of 7. By focusing on broader movements, you can get a better understanding of the philosophical chassis that helps those artists of that period ascertain the truth, rather than get tips on how to paint clouds. Because ultimately, our job as painters is to tell the truth. If you're looking for your style, give up right now. There is no such thing as a style. There are only your interests. Imitate all you want, and everything you get wrong will end up being your style. But an imitation is, by definition, a pale copy of the original. What gets you out of bed every morning? Find that thing and then scream it as loudly into our faces as you can. The only way to find your style is to make hundreds and hundreds of paintings and drawings and destroy all of them. Don't be precious. For example, my approach to landscape painting is akin to medieval art, and I'll explain what I mean. In the Middle Ages, nature was believed to have been created by God for man and woman. Therefore, nature was subordinate to man and woman. As an extension, medieval art didn't perceive objects as existing in the same space. Each thing was a separate entity. An image was more significant than making it look realistic. The essence was enough. A quote by post-impressionist Émile Bernard might be helpful here. He wrote, You have to simplify the spectacle in order to make some sense of it. You have, in a way, to draw its plan. Bernard was speaking in the late 1880s, but he might as well have been speaking in 1080. Medieval artists had no need for suggesting deep pictorial space or material volume. The flat surface wasn't a physical limitation, it was the whole point. Flatness represented a realm of spiritual awareness in which figure and ground were compressed into patterns that were sometimes interchangeable. If you see the figure, then it comes forward. If you see the background, then it comes forward. What you see is what matters. Kind of like blowing on wind chimes. A wind chime has no purpose without wind. Let your eyes be the wind. It doesn't take much to chime. A medieval artist exists inside the pictorial world that they create, as opposed to a Renaissance artist who uses perspective to stand outside the world they're representing, as if peering through a window. Both are valid. I feel more affinity with the former because he or she isn't recreating an experience, but fully possessing it. A painting should feel warmed up and worn in, as if thousands of hidden eyes had been folded into the wet pigment. The painted surface should be erect and face the viewer rather than turn away. I don't want to paint a view of a landscape, but make the viewer feel as if they've been spun around and are inside the view. When you're painting, ask yourself, is your subject the light or the thing being lit? For me, it's the light. Hans Hofmann said, in nature, light creates color. In painting, color creates light. I equate bright color with the brilliance of light. But it's never about a single color, but groupings of colors, which, like wind chimes, only serve their purpose when they're colliding with one another. And therein lies an important word for every artist: purpose. Inspiration and purpose are not the same thing. The magician Teller said that art is what we do after the chores are done. Inspiration is a person, place, or experience that makes you want to do or create something, which to me sounds like a colossal potential letdown. You must rely on yourself. The only thing you can depend on is your work schedule. Be your own best friend. That's where purpose lives. Ask yourself, if you didn't need money to survive, how would you spend your time? Pick the easy lane. Do what feels good, and always know that there'll be someone who does it better. Human beings used to live in groups of about 100 or so everyone could get really good at something. Now, with social media, we are constantly pummeled by the best of the best. It's a total waste of time comparing your insides to other people's outsides. There is nothing interesting about perfection. When I sit under a tree and draw it, I copy what I see. I don't make shit up. When I paint, I try to peel back the layer of that appearance to expose the treeness of the tree. This gives me the freedom to invent, rather than just do copying exercises. The world doesn't need another painting of a tree. What it needs is one person's experience warmed up and ready for consumption. We can't see everything there is to see. Some stuff remains hidden. Every landscape I paint is made up. I'm talking bed, bath, and way beyond. I'm not painting nature, but making structures and adding nature to it. The best compliment I get is when folks come up to me and say, "You don't paint real places, yet I recognize them, as if I've actually been there." What's more real? Accurately painted foliage or carefully calibrated shapes and colors that trigger lucidity through the marriage of sense and sight. Coherence is not the same as resolution. There must be tension. For me, nature looks best laid out on my studio table. There's no such thing as a nature painter. Every painting is a studio painting when contemplated. In my work, I exaggerate the painted surface with thick paint to achieve the same end, always present, always foreground. I don't rely on illusion to suggest depth. If I want a form to appear closer, then I paint it bigger and thicker than the other forms. If one color appears to pass over another, that's because it actually does. There are no tricks. Bob Dylan said, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." When you can see how it's done, it deepens the mystery. Before you apply paint, look closely at the linen. Run your fingers over it and let that friction create heat to bind you with the material. I like a rough tooth linen because it allows paint to be picked off with my brush, with a little bit of sliding in between. From the rough paint, I smooth it out with a rag so that the two different surfaces reveal a transfer of energy between mind and hand. The painter Milton Avery captured a single instant in nature by squishing on color with a knife and then blending it with his fingers until he got a shiny enamel surface. This allowed the thicker strokes to take on a more structural role. His sensitivity to atmosphere and place was learned from the American Impressionists like Ernest Lawson and George Inness, who created single tones made up of many delicate layers of color. Pleasure is itself content.